Okay, what I want to do is a short interlude. So here in front of you, you see a superb example of primitive art graphics. Um, we went over this in the general discussion of concepts, but I want to go back to it because from now through the rest of the semester, this is going to become a really understanding this clearly is going to be necessary to make sense of how people relate to each other. So what you see here, oops, hang on a second, I won't do it, focus. There it goes. What you see here is we'll say good example would be England. So this is England. Now, England at some point, because of military superiority or whatever, goes and takes over another place. Now, you don't even have to go very far. In the case of this, you could argue that the English go and they take over, for example, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And the key here is they can do it because they just beat them up. But we'll use the example of India since that's actually easier. So the English go, they sail over here to India. They initially do trade, and eventually they go send military forces. And then by 1850s, we'll get into later about the complications. By the 1850s, the British basically control the whole subcontinent of India. That includes India, what's now Sri Lanka, it's what's now Pakistan, et cetera, all part of the British Empire. And so they've done that by going over there, basically whacking on the locals till locals surrender and give in. So here you've got this group here takes over that group somewhere else. The key with colonizing is you go somewhere else. It can be next door with the British, going north to Scotland or west to Wales. But in most cases, it's a longer distance. The British colonized Canada, for example. So what you do is you go and take this group over. Now, the key to the model of colonization isn't that you do it. It's what you get out of it. Now, what you get out of it is very, very much in the interest of the guys that do the colonizing, because they're the ones, if you want to put it in modern context, they won. So in that context, what they do is they now bring all sorts of stuff to this place. They bring their version of what might be education, legal systems, frequently language, frequently religion, just a whole package of things that make them them. In many cases, the type of stuff that they think allowed them to take these people over. So in other words, we're better than you because of this. This will have a list. And because of that list, we're going to go over now that we've taken you over, we'll teach you some of that stuff so that you're not so lame next time around. And so there's this sort of, we beat you, so we get you to tell you what to do. That's one of the basic premises of colonization. Now, in some cases, and Hawaii is a good example of this, you can actually sort of do this in a slightly different mode. In that situation, if you look at the United States and Hawaii, what you have is Hawaii is an independent country. The United States basically puts large amounts of money, invest in Hawaii. The United States becomes Hawaii's only market for selling products. And so what you get is an economic relationships where the United States is dominant and Hawaii is very much at their mercy. But until 1893, they don't do anything about it in the sense that that's just the way the relationship goes. When the United States finally gets tired of this and decides that they really want to control the place, then you send in military troops and you take over Hawaii, and Hawaii becomes a territory. So the overthrow was classic colonialism, but it was done in the case of Hawaii. There was actually a lot of interaction prior to that, and even in the case of the British in India, the British were doing trade in India for 100, 150 years before they took most of the place over. So it isn't like you got a bunch of guys with guns sailing around the boat looking for a place to pick on. There's usually some reason why they pick a place, and some other places they might decide it's not worth it. There's some places that don't really ever get particularly colonized just because no one gets a real huge amount of excitement about doing it. So the key when you're done with all this is these guys now can export everything here. These guys are fixed consumers. They don't have any choice in the matter. So for example, in India, you had legal systems in place, but the British didn't care. The British come in, it's going to be the British legal system. The British try to import Christianity. That doesn't work very well, but they still use Christian morality to basically say the things you can't do if you're conservatively Hindu. So you can't, burn women anymore, burn widows when their husbands died. You're not supposed to have the same level of caste segregation that you did before. So all sorts of things that were traditionally part of Hindu Indian society are not allowed because the British won't allow it because it runs against their religious moral code. And they can enforce that because it's their police, their military, their legal system, their prisons. Okay. So it doesn't matter what you want over here. You're going to do what these guys tell you to, because if you don't, you're going to end up in prison or get shot. So it's a real simple, it's a real simple message. The reason they'll say we did that is because, well, we conquered you. So, what we want is what you're going to get, and that's it. Now, the other part of this is what do these guys actually get back? Because if you think about it, this is all expensive. You're sending military over here. You're sending specialists like lawyers or judges. You're sending, prison guards. I mean, whatever it is, you're sending all this technology and all these specialized folks over here. What's in it for these guys other than ego? And what's in it for them are a whole mess of things. Most importantly, this is now a captive market. These guys have a monopoly on goods and services. If you want to buy something here, it's going to be from here. So, and a good example is tea. Tea actually comes from China. The British like tea. The British start consuming a lot of tea once they interact with the Chinese. And they then decide that the Chinese price for tea is too high. They smuggle out tea plants, take them to India, and make the Indians grow tea. And now a large chunk of the world's population drinks Indian tea, like Darjeeling or something like that, not Chinese. In England, ironically, they also shipped this to another colonial possession, Kenya, in Africa, which is then British colonial possession. And that's where a lot of British tea is actually still drunk today, is actually grown in Kenya. So you don't grow the tea in England. You get these places you've taken over, and you basically say, hey, we got this, 10,000 acres. I don't care what you're growing there, but you're going to start growing tea. And that's what it's going to be. And by the way, we're going to tell you what we're going to pay for it. Because remember, these guys are not in a situation to say, well, this is what it's going to cost you. These guys are going to tell you what you're going to charge. So it's an entirely fixed captive market. And one of the ways that you do this very specifically is you make sure that all the manufactured products, if you would, say in the industrial period, all the stuff that comes out of a factory is going to come from here. So your high-paid factory workers, intellectuals, trained folks and stuff like that are going to be in the home country, if you want to think of it that way. It's frequently how it's said, which is sort of bizarre because, of course, it's not their home. And that's what these guys can buy. So if you want to buy a phone, if you want to buy a car, if you want to buy a motorcycle, you want to buy all this stuff, then these guys have to buy ones that are made here. Now, it's great for the folks that have factories here because it's a guaranteed market. They don't have to worry about competing with French or German or other types of, say, motorcycles, because if you're here, the only motorcycles you're allowed to purchase are the ones that are made in England. And this becomes the British Empire, and you see this with all the empires. The British is probably the most striking because you still find a lot of stuff that people eat in former British areas that are a part of this. Horlicks is a good example. I'm trying to think of the other one, starts with a W. It's like a chocolate, or a Nestle. The Nestle's malts, which British consume. They're made in England. In fact, they're still made in England. And you find them in Hong Kong, you find them in Canada, you find them anywhere the British were. You find a lot of folks drink that stuff because they got the habit from these guys. And also you didn't have other choices because you couldn't buy French or German or other type of beverages. They had to be British style beverages if they were packaged. Could only be packaged from here. Now, the other thing these guys get out of these guys is raw materials. So example, again, the tea. These guys have to use the water, the labor, and everything else. And tea is very labor intensive because you have to pick it by hand. So you get there and you take those bushes, pick all the leaves by hand, dry them in India, package them, and then you ship that to England. So the British get to drink the tea. The Indians have to go through the trouble of making it. So if this is Canada, this becomes logs. Logging industry becomes iron ore, becomes all the stuff that the British take out of Canada. And then what they do is they give them goodies back in terms of manufactured goods. The Canadians cough this stuff up and all the stuff goes here for British manufacturing. So you get this weird situation, for example, in Canada's case. Well, actually, let's use the standard one way. So what you get is the British are big into making cloth. They tell the Indians you're going to start growing lots of cotton, which they didn't prior to this. So the Indians start growing lots of cotton. These are cotton plantations. The prices are fixed. And so the cotton's the cotton, like a cotton ball type cotton, is a fixed price. So these guys make almost no money here. The labor is incredibly cheap. It's near slave labor, and it comes over here, and that's really handy because then what the British do is the British weave it into cloth. Now, you're not allowed in India to weave cloth. You buy cloth from the British guys. So the irony is you literally have, 5,000 acres of cotton outside. Every day you're picking cotton and, putting cotton into bales and stuff like that. But you can't turn that into thread. You can't turn it into cloth. That has to go to England for that to happen. Then you buy it from these guys. So that's the colonial system. These guys get a huge amount of it because the natural resources, the cheap labor, the guaranteed market is what they get in terms of winnings, if you want to think about it, after having conquered these folks. That's a colonial system. Okay? And that's really, really key for almost this entire semester because a huge part of the world, especially in the period from 1700 to basically 1960, was a colonial possession of someplace else. And you have to remember that's only 40, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. In fact, you could argue that the Warsaw Pact states were colonial possessions of the Soviet Union right till 1990. And that's certainly the way a lot of them, like Romania and Slovakia, see themselves. or especially say Lithuania and Estonia. They see themselves as colonial possessions. That's how Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, a lot of these former parts of the Soviet Union see themselves as legitimate. Because that's what it was. Russia, in the sense of Moscow, one takes them over. They become cheap markets, cheap labor, guaranteed markets, for Russian products, which keeps Russian manufacturing going, and they provide the resources to make the manufacturing go, but they're not allowed to do it themselves. So this is one reason why what's called Eastern Europe has such a hard time when it gets into the 1990s, and this suddenly is gone. Because once that's not there, then all of a sudden they have to play catch up because they don't have these manufacturing industry, because they're basically providing services to this place to control them. Now, last example of this is the motorcycle I want to buy. So one of the biggest motorcycle brands right into the 1950s was Royal Enfield, which also made guns. I'm not quite sure how they ended up in motorcycles. So they made motorcycles, one of the world's largest motorcycle manufacturers out of England. In the post-World War II period, in fact, I think they did during World War II because they made military motorcycles. They set up a factory in India. So then they start making motorcycles in India. Now, what happens is over time, by the 1950s, 1960s, especially the 1960s, labor costs in England are really high. There's a lot of labor unrest. And one of the side effects of that is the quality of manufactured goods in England is really crap. So the motorcycles, the Royal Enfield are making in England, the parts fall off all the time. Nothing works right. They're lousy. And yet they were really good motorcycles before. So it's not the design. It's just people aren't motivated on the assembly lines to do this where they don't want to do it. And sort of like, screw you and I'm out of here. And so what happens is that the manufacturing in India ends up, as they get more into it, their quality of their motorcycles is actually higher than the British ones. And on top of that, not only are they higher, they're also, of course, a lot cheaper because the labor costs are so much lower in India. So Royal Enfield eventually shuts down now that India is independent. So they're no longer in this situation per se. In the early 1960s, Royal Enfield shuts down their British motorcycle plant and just makes motorcycles in India. So it's become Royal Enfield basically moves to India, and they keep that up. By the early 2000s, Royal Enfield is already the world's largest motorcycle manufacturer, in large part because in a lot of Asia, people buy motorcycles instead of cars. They're just a lot more practical for a lot of stuff that you're going to do. So motorcycles are sort of the equivalent to what Americans would use cars for. And in that situation, Royal Enfield is one of the world's large, along with Honda's, the other two really large motorcycle manufacturers making these. Now, the interesting thing is what happens is they keep on making the same motorcycle. The motorcycles are sort of new and improved versions of the very same motorcycle they made 60 years earlier. So ironically, by the 2000s, this is now a retro motorcycle because it's just like the motorcycle your grandpa owned in 1952. It's still being made in India. The build quality is better. It's still good looking. And so what happens is by the 2000s, is Royal Enfield then starts to market their motorcycles, ironically, in England. So English folks that remember when you used to see those motorcycles around, but now they're collectors' pieces and they're 7 years old and they fall apart. Now you can buy a brand new British motorcycle made in India, sold in England. And so what happens is they become they're now the top motorcycle brand globally, and they're the top motorcycle manufacturer in England. But they don't make any bikes in England, but ironically, the bike was originally designed and originally made in England. So this one becomes one of the aspects of this colonial circle. Is eventually what happens is it can spin out in some cases, like Royal Enfield actually reverses itself. Cute bikes, really nice bikes. They're now dominating the American market. Their prices are really, really low, again, because their labor costs are still lower. Build quality is actually better than, say, Harleys and stuff like that. So what you get is they're now becoming the world's, at least in the US and Canada, now becoming one of the largest, new motorcycles you can buy in this area. And they are in England. They're already totally dominant in England, in fact, throughout Europe. So what they've done is they've literally come back from their colonial heritage and come back and basically taken over the place that originally conquered them. That's just an example of one product, but it's an example of how this process can change over time as the dynamics change.